There's a place deep in the Appalachian Mountains where the mist lingers long after the sun sets. People who live there, or once did, say it's not just the fog that holds secrets, it's the land itself, full of things that can't be explained. One story, passed down through generations, begins with a group of college students out for a weekend hike, wanting to experience the wildness of the Appalachian wilderness. They were looking for adventure, the kind of thrill that only the mountains can provide. They set out early one autumn morning, the crisp mountain air biting at their skin as they trekked deeper into the forest. Their destination was an old, forgotten trail, one that wasn't marked on any modern maps. They thought it'd be fun to try something off the beaten path, just for the excitement of it. But as they journeyed deeper into the woods, something felt wrong. It wasn't the usual sense of isolation that comes with being in nature. It was something more sinister, a creeping unease that settled over them like a heavy fog. One by one, the group began to notice strange things, a rustling sound in the trees when there was no wind, footsteps following them just out of sight. They chalked it up to their nerves and tried to laugh it off. After all, they were in the mountains. Strange things happened in the woods, didn't they? By nightfall, they found an old, dilapidated cabin tucked away between the trees, half covered in moss and vines. It looked abandoned, but there was something about it that felt wrong. The door hung crooked on its hinges, and the windows were dark. But one of the students, eager for shelter from the cold, pushed the door open. The others hesitated, but then followed. Inside, it was cold and damp, the air thick with the smell of mildew and decay. The floorboards creaked under their weight as they explored, finding nothing but rotting furniture and the remnants of what looked like a hasty, long-forgotten abandonment. But something caught one of the students' eyes. A strange symbol carved into the wall near the fireplace. It wasn't like anything they had seen before, a twisted circular pattern that seemed to shift when looked at from different angles. They didn't linger in the cabin long. Unease was growing, and their initial excitement began to drain away. The night seemed to stretch on forever, and the wind outside began to howl as if the forest itself were alive and angry. They decided to leave before the darkness swallowed them whole. That's when the real terror began. As they stepped out of the cabin, the world around them had changed. The trail they had followed in was gone, replaced by dense, impenetrable trees that stretched to the sky. The sky was dark now, and the stars above flickered like cold eyes watching them. They tried to retrace their steps, but nothing looked familiar. No matter which direction they turned, it seemed as though the woods were closing in on them. That's when they realized they weren't alone. At first, it was just shadows moving between the trees, nothing solid, just shapes that didn't belong. Then they heard the whispers, low, guttural voices that seemed to come from all around them, too faint to understand but too close to ignore. Panic set in. They began to run, but the woods were endless, and the trail, if there had ever been one, was gone. It felt like the mountain itself was toying with them. One by one, the students started to disappear. At first, it was the girl with the red jacket. She was there, then gone. A rustle in the trees, a brief scream, and nothing more. They couldn't find her, no matter how hard they searched. Then it was another student, the tall guy with glasses. He had been in front of them, but when they turned around, he was gone, vanished into the mist like he'd never existed. As the night stretched on, only two of them remained. The fear was palpable, overwhelming. They stumbled through the trees, barely able to breathe, the whispers growing louder, closer, until they finally collapsed in exhaustion at the base of a giant oak. And that's when they saw it. At the edge of the clearing, standing just within the shadows of the trees, was something they couldn't understand, a figure, humanoid but wrong. Its skin was pale, almost gray, and it had eyes that seemed too large for its face. It didn't move, didn't speak, but its presence was enough to freeze them in place. The whispers grew to a crescendo, and then suddenly, everything stopped. The air went still, and for a moment, there was only silence. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the figure was gone. The remaining students didn't waste a second. They ran blindly through the woods, not stopping until they stumbled out of the forest back to civilization. They never spoke of what happened again. The two who made it out alive went back to their lives, but the others were never seen again. Some say they were taken by the mountain, lost forever to whatever haunted those woods. Others believe they were never meant to come back. And the few who know the full story, they say there's something worse than the fog waiting in those hills. Something that doesn't just watch, but waits for you to cross its path. To this day, that cabin remains out there, deep in the Appalachian Mountains, and the whispers still follow anyone brave or foolish enough to venture too close.
Story number 2.
In the shadow of the Appalachian Mountains, there's a long-forgotten town called Cold Hollow. Over the years, it was abandoned, but some of its inhabitants were never seen again. The woods around it are dense, thick with trees so old that they almost seem to whisper their own secrets. Those who've dared to venture near Cold Hollow have returned with strange stories. But one tale stands out above the rest, one so chilling that even the bravest of locals refuse to speak its name. It begins with a family, a mother, father, and their 2 children who had moved to a small house on the outskirts of Cold Hollow. They had heard stories of how the area was cursed, but they didn't believe in such things. The mountains were beautiful, and they longed for a quieter life away from the noise of the city. But that quiet soon turned to silence, and that silence began to suffocate them. It started with the odd sounds at night. At first, they thought it was just the wind rustling through the trees, but it was different, too rhythmic, too deliberate. There were footsteps, soft at first, like someone was walking just outside their window. The family assumed it was animals, maybe deer or raccoons, but that theory began to fall apart when the footsteps didn't match anything natural. They were too heavy, too human. Then came the scratching. It wasn't on the windows, as one might expect, but on the floorboards inside the house. Long, dragging noises that seemed to move across the rooms. At first, the parents thought it was just a part of the old house settling, but the children could hear it too, and they started to grow terrified. They would lie in bed, eyes wide with fear, listening to the dragging noises come closer, closer, until they could feel the cold breath of something near. One night, the father decided to investigate. Armed with a flashlight, he moved through the house, calling out to see if maybe it was an animal stuck somewhere in the walls. But when he reached the attic, something stopped him. The air was thick, suffocating. And in the far corner of the room, there was a shape. It was tall, hunched, its back curved in a way that made the father's blood run cold. He could barely make out its form in the dim light, but its eyes, pale and unblinking, were fixed on him. It didn't move, just watched. The father ran. He bolted out of the house, never looking back, and spent the night sitting in his truck, trying to make sense of what he had seen. When he returned the next morning, he found his wife and children sitting in the living room, staring at the floor with hollow eyes. They hadn't heard a thing. No sounds, no scraping, no footsteps. It was as if the house had swallowed the events of the previous night. The family left Cold Hollow soon after, but the house remained. For years, no one dared to buy it, and the land around it was said to be cursed. But one autumn, a young couple new to the area bought the house, eager to start a new life. They heard the rumors, of course, but they dismissed them, chalking them up to old superstitions. They moved in without a second thought, and for a while, everything was fine. The first few nights were peaceful, but soon the strange noises returned, scratching at the floor, dragging footsteps, the oppressive silence that came before the whispers. One evening, the husband, fed up with the madness, decided to confront whatever haunted the house. He went to the attic, flashlight in hand, and the moment he stepped onto the old floorboards, the temperature dropped. He could see his breath, and then from the corner of the room, the shape appeared again. But this time it moved. The thing was not human. It was long, too long, with limbs that twisted and writhed like branches in a storm. Its face was a blur of features, its eyes black, empty voids that seemed to swallow all light. It crept closer, the floorboards groaning under its weight, but the husband couldn't move. It was as if the thing had some power over him, some force that bound him in place, unable to escape. When the wife came searching for him, she found him standing in the attic, frozen, staring at the thing with terror in his eyes. He didn't speak. She called to him, but he didn't move. It wasn't until she touched his arm that the thing let out a low, guttural growl, and vanished into the shadows of the room. The couple left that very night, never returning. Some say the thing still waits in the attic, watching anyone who dares step foot in the house. And though Cold Hollow is abandoned, some say that on moonless nights you can still hear the dragging footsteps, the scraping on the floor, as if the very house itself is alive and waiting. One thing's for sure, if you ever find yourself near Cold Hollow and you hear that strange sound, don't go looking. It's already too late. The thing is already there, watching you from the shadows, waiting to claim you next.
Story number 3.
There's an old legend in the Appalachian Mountains about a place known the Whistler's Hollow. It's a dark, twisted story that no one dares to speak of, and those who have ventured too close have never returned. The few who live near the area tell of a constant, eerie sound that haunts the hollow, a soft, distant whistling. The sound itself is unsettling, not the kind of whistle you'd hear from a bird or the wind. No, this is something deeper, something darker, that sounds like it's coming from the very earth itself. It starts with a group of friends who were out on a camping trip in the mountains. They were experienced hikers, confident in their abilities to handle anything the wilderness could throw at them. They had heard the whispers about Whistler's Hollow, but like so many before them, they dismissed it as nothing more than local superstition. They set up camp in a secluded spot surrounded by towering trees and a steep cliffside. As night fell, the usual sounds of nature filled the air, crickets chirping, the wind rustling through the leaves. But then, as the fire crackled and they began telling stories, they heard it. A faint whistling sound, barely audible at first. It seemed to come from the distance, high in the trees, almost as if someone were beckoning them. They laughed it off, calling it the wind or an animal, but the sound grew louder, clearer. One of the friends, curious, decided to follow it. He stood up and began walking toward the source of the whistle. The others warned him to stay close, but he shrugged them off, eager to see what was causing the strange noise. As he ventured deeper into the woods, the whistling grew louder, and something about it felt wrong. It wasn't just a random tune, it was deliberate, coaxing, pulling him further. The forest seemed to close in around him as he followed the sound, his heart pounding in his chest. After what felt like an eternity, he came to a clearing where the trees parted, revealing an old, dilapidated shack. It looked as if it had been abandoned for decades. The door was cracked open, and the whistling was unmistakably coming from inside. Without thinking, he stepped forward, his feet dragging through the thick underbrush. He pushed open the door and entered the shack. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of rot and decay. The floorboards creaked beneath his weight, and the faint sound of whistling grew even louder, as though it were coming from the walls themselves. The room was dim, lit only by the faint light of the moon filtering through the cracks in the walls. There was a figure standing in the far corner of the room, tall and thin, almost skeletal, its back turned to him. The figure was whistling. The man froze, his eyes widened with terror. The figure, though human in shape, was wrong. Its skin was pale, stretched too thin, and its long fingers were twisted unnaturally. It wasn't just whistling, it was calling him, beckoning him with every note. The air turned cold. His body felt heavy, as if the very ground beneath him was pulling him down. He tried to turn, to run, but his legs wouldn't move. The whistling stopped for a moment, and then the figure slowly turned toward him. Its eyes were hollow, dark pits that seemed to draw him in. The man tried to scream, but no sound escaped his throat. He felt his vision blur, his mind growing foggy, as if the thing in front of him was sucking the life from him, piece by piece. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the whistling stopped. The man's body was still frozen, but the figure was gone. The shack was silent. The air felt thick, suffocating. He stumbled backward toward the door, but when he reached it, he saw something that made his blood run cold. The forest had changed. What was once a dense, dark wood was now a twisted maze of black trees, their branches reaching out like claws. The sky had turned an unnatural shade of red, and the sound of the whistling returned, now coming from every direction. It was no longer a song, it was a warning. With a scream that was barely audible, the man bolted from the shack, running blindly through the trees. But the forest seemed endless, and every turn brought him back to the same place, the clearing, the shack. the figure. The whistling never stopped. The others found him hours later, wandering aimlessly in the woods. His eyes were wide with terror, his clothes torn, and he kept mumbling incoherently about the thing that had followed him. They managed to get him back to camp, but the man was never the same. He couldn't sleep, couldn't speak without trembling, and would often stare into the woods at listening to the whistling that no one else could hear. The group packed up and left the next morning, but the man never fully recovered. He would sometimes disappear for days at a time, wandering the woods, always following the sound of the whistle. He was never found again. The locals say that Whistler's Hollow is cursed, that the whistling isn't just a sound, but a call to those who dare enter, to those who listen too long. And they say the figure, tall and thin with hollow eyes, still waits in the clearing, whistling for anyone foolish enough to follow. Those who do are never seen again, their souls claimed by the thing in the woods. And if you ever hear the whistling in the Appalachian night, don't follow it. Turn away, because once you hear it, it won't stop calling, and there's no escape.
Story number 4.
In the Appalachian Mountains, there is a place that's never found on any map, the Black Hollow. Few people know of it, and fewer still have dared to venture near it. The locals, grizzled and tough from years of living in isolation, speak of it in hushed tones, warning anyone who asks about the cursed land. The story that haunts Black Hollow is one of slow descent into madness, a story that no one should ever hear, and certainly no one should ever experience. The tale starts with a man named Elijah, a seasoned trapper who had lived alone in the mountains for many years. He had heard the rumors, of course, about the strange happenings in Black Hollow. People whispered about the trees that would move on their own, the animals that wouldn't come close, and the chilling sounds that echoed through the woods. But Elijah didn't believe in superstition. He had hunted these mountains for decades, and there wasn't a place he hadn't explored. One autumn, Elijah found himself in need of a new trapping ground. His old spots had yielded little game recently, and the hunger of the coming winter gnawed at him. One evening, after a few drinks by the fire, an old man in town, half drunk and grinning crookedly, told him about Black Hollow. "Go on, trapper. If you're brave enough, you'll find more game than you could dream of in that hollow," the man had said, his eyes gleaming. Elijah laughed it off, but the idea began to gnaw at him. The more he thought about it, the more the idea of venturing into Black Hollow seemed like the perfect challenge. The next day he packed up his gear and set off, eager to prove that he wasn't afraid of old wives' tales. He hiked for hours through dense, mist-filled woods, the trees towering above him like silent giants. As night fell, he reached the heart of Black Hollow. The air grew still, thick with a sense of unease that prickled his skin. It was as if the whole world had gone quiet. There was no sound, no birds, no wind, nothing. Elijah set up camp, but as he did, something felt off. The forest felt alive, watching him. He ignored the growing sense of discomfort and settled in for the night, confident that nothing could scare him. But then came the whispers. They were faint at first, almost like the rustling of leaves, but as the night wore on, they grew louder, more distinct. The voices were low, like distant murmurs, too faint to make out the words. Elijah sat up in his sleeping bag, listening. The sound was coming from all around him, as if the trees themselves were whispering secrets. He felt his heart race as the whispers grew louder until they were all he could hear. And then they stopped. For a moment, all was silent, but in that silence, something worse happened. From the shadows of the trees, something moved. A shape, no, more like a shadow, shifted through the woods, fluid and unnatural, like a nightmare stalking its prey. Elijah grabbed his rifle and stood, but the shadow darted out of sight before he could get a clear shot. The feeling of being watched intensified, and then the whispers returned, closer this time. They weren't just whispers anymore. They were words. Leave now. But Elijah wasn't about to run. He had come this far, and he was determined to make it through the night. He lit his lantern and tried to focus on the task at hand, setting traps and keeping his mind busy. As the night dragged on, Elijah's sense of time began to warp. The shadows seemed to stretch and twist around him, the trees leaning in closer. He couldn't tell if it was the moonlight or something else, but the forest around him was changing. The trees, once still, now looked alive, their bark seeming to twitch and ripple like skin. The whispers became louder, more frantic, until they were almost a cacophony. "Get out! It's too late! Leave now!" Then the air grew heavy, thick with a suffocating pressure. Elijah's vision blurred. He stumbled, trying to keep his bearings, but the whispers were overwhelming, nearly maddening. He looked around in panic, but all he saw were the twisted shadows of trees closing in, their branches reaching out like fingers. Something brushed his leg. It was cold, unnaturally cold. He turned, but there was nothing there. The whispers became an unbearable scream in his head. "Leave before it's too late!" That's when he saw them. From the darkness, figures began to emerge. They weren't human, at least not anymore. Their faces were twisted, their eyes black as coal, their limbs impossibly long and thin. They crawled on all fours, moving with unnatural speed, their mouths stretching into gaping smiles, too wide, too wrong. And their eyes, they locked onto Elijah with an intensity that froze him in place. The figures were closing in. He raised his rifle, but his hand shook, and before he could fire, the shadows lunged and everything went black. Elijah was never seen again. A week later, a search party was sent into Black Hollow. They found his camp, his gear scattered around, but there was no sign of him. There were no footprints, no trail, nothing to suggest he had left the area. But when they went deeper into the hollow, they heard something. The same whispers. And in the distance, a figure, just one, standing in the shadows of the trees, its hollow eyes watching them. They didn't wait to find out what else might be lurking in the dark. The only thing they found was Elijah's rifle, lying in the dirt, its barrel covered in strange, slick black markings. Some say Elijah's soul was taken by the hollow, that he became one of the twisted figures that haunted the woods. And to this day, no one dares to enter Black Hollow after dark. The whispers are still there, calling to anyone foolish enough to listen. And if you hear them, it's already too late. The mountain has claimed another.
Story number 5.
Deep in the Appalachian Mountains, where the fog clings to the ridgelines and the trees grow thick with moss, there lies a place known as Devil's Bend. No one who has ventured into the bend after nightfall has ever come back the same, and some never come back at all. The locals talk about it in hushed tones, warning outsiders to stay far away. But, as with all cursed places, there are always those who are too curious or too foolish to heed the warnings. The story begins with a group of college students eager for a weekend getaway to get away from the stresses of exams and life in the city. They had heard stories of Devil's Bend, of course, but dismissed them as old superstitions. After all, they were young and fearless, keen to explore places untouched by modern life. They set out one Friday evening, driving along winding, dark roads until they arrived at the edge of the bend. The air was thick with mist, and the sun had already dipped below the horizon, leaving only the faintest glimmers of twilight. They set up camp by a small creek, laughing and telling stories around the fire. Everything felt normal until the sun disappeared completely and the air grew unnaturally cold. It started with a voice. At first, they thought it was just one of their friends playing a prank. But the voice was different. It wasn't one of them. It was low and guttural, almost like it came from the earth itself. It called out to them in a whisper, so faint they could barely hear it. "Come closer." The wind seemed to carry the words. They laughed it off at first, blaming the cold, the isolation, the stress of the semester, and a bit of too much drinking. But then the voice grew louder, clearer. "Come closer, I'm waiting for you." Something in the tone sent a shiver down their spines, but still, they laughed it off. They tried to ignore it, tried to focus on the fire. But every time the wind shifted, the voice would return, calling them, coaxing them to the edge of the bend. One of the students, Sarah, grew uneasy. She stood up suddenly and walked toward the trees. "It's just some animal or a trick of the wind," she said. "I'll be back." The others protested, but she was already gone. They watched her disappear into the mist, and the voice grew louder. "Sarah, Sarah." Minutes passed, and then an hour. Sarah didn't return. Panic set in. The group called her name, their voices shaking in the stillness. But there was no answer, only that haunting whisper, drawing closer, moving with the wind. One by one, the others started to follow the sound. They called out for Sarah, but no one responded. It was as if the forest itself had swallowed her whole. They searched for what felt like hours, but the deeper they ventured, the more the forest seemed to warp around them. The trees seemed to lean toward them, their gnarled branches reaching like skeletal fingers, and the ground beneath their feet became slick with something they couldn't quite explain. They stumbled upon a clearing, a strange, unnatural place where the mist gathered thick like a wall of smoke. And in the center of the clearing, they found her. Sarah was standing there, frozen in place. Her eyes were wide, her mouth agape, but she didn't respond when they called her name. As they approached, the air around her grew icy and the whispering returned. But this time, it wasn't the wind. It was coming from Sarah herself. "Stay with me," she whispered, her voice a hollow echo. "Stay with me. I need you." They tried to pull her away, but her body seemed stiff, as though she was being held in place by some unseen force. And then something else appeared in the mist, something tall and twisted, a shape too dark to make out. Its outline shimmered, almost like smoke, but when it moved, it was unnatural, like it was crawling out of the very ground. It was the thing that had called Sarah. The others screamed and pulled at her, but it was as if she was rooted to the spot. The figure in the mist moved closer, its form shifting and warping, like a silhouette of something that never should have existed in the first place. Its face, if it could be called that, was just a mass of shadow and gnashing teeth, and its eyes, black, hollow pits, locked onto them, drawing them in as if it wanted them to look to see it. But before they could do anything, Sarah's eyes went blank, and she spoke, her voice no longer her own. "It's too late for you." A sound like a growl emanated from the darkness, and the trees around them began to shake violently. The ground cracked beneath their feet, and the very air seemed to pulse with an oppressive weight. The group was paralyzed with fear, unable to move. One of the students, Dan, finally broke free from the trance and grabbed Sarah, trying to drag her away from the thing. But as he pulled her, the figure reached out with one long skeletal hand and touched his arm. The moment it made contact, Dan screamed. His body jerked violently, as if it was being pulled into the ground itself. His skin turned pale, his veins blackened, and with one final agonizing scream, he collapsed. The thing released him, and he crumpled to the forest floor, his eyes wide open but vacant, like something had sucked the life right out of him. The others were screaming, trying to flee, but it was too late. The mist surrounded them, thick and choking. The last thing they saw was Sarah's face, her eyes empty, staring into the void, her mouth still whispering those words, "Stay with me." When the authorities arrived the next morning, there was no sign of the group. The campfire was still smoldering, but the campsite was abandoned, as though they had vanished without a trace. The only thing left was a single, blood-stained jacket, Sarah's. Some say the mist still lingers around Devil's Bend, that if you're unlucky enough to venture into the woods at night, you can still hear the whispering. And sometimes, if you're close enough, you'll see the figures in the mist, waiting for the next soul to take. And if you listen closely, you might hear Sarah's voice too, calling you to join her in the hollow. Stay with me.